What's up, fellow music nerds? Matrix here, and you are locked into the Matrix Music Review Podcast, the only place to get your fix for alternative music. And we are back. I know we took a week off there and you guys didn't get a pod, but that's because, damn, y'all really loved that mid-year list and those mid-year rankings. And I appreciate all the support. It was a lot of fun to do. As we get closer to the end of the year, obviously I will do one for the end of the year as well, and I can't wait to do that. That's a lot of fun, and a lot of the reason why you do some of the things like this is to get to the end of the year and realize what's been your favorite, what's been the best, and hopefully introduce some people to some new music, new tracks, whatever it may be, even new artists. So appreciate all the support on that. And we're back this week with another special episode. So I won't be doing any reviews this week. Don't worry, I'll get back to that next time we all get together. I know you guys are probably going to be really excited for the Paris album that was out. We got the new Yellow Card EP. Obviously, I've listened to all that already, and I'm already formulating my thoughts on that, and I will tell you that it's all good stuff so far. But in the meantime, if this is your first time being here with us, head on over to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok and give us a follow at Matrix Music Review. Head on over to Spotify and like our Control-Alt-Save playlist. It'll be linked in the description of this episode. And as I always do, I ask you to share this podcast with your friends, your family. Keep spreading the word about this podcast so that everybody else can continue to learn about the new and improved alternative music that's out and just can continue to grow this little scene. I feel like the alternative music scene, and when I say alternative, I mean this alternative rock, pop, punk, emo, metalcore scene that has really just kind of had a revival here in the past couple of years. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about today, the popularity of the scene itself. And another little fun piece that I'm going to talk about today is the prevalence that we saw back in the early 2000s to mid 2000s in video games. And then talk about if it's coming back, and if it does come back, what should it sound like? So hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this one. I had a lot of fun, coming up with this idea, and a lot of fun thinking about different things like that. So we're going to start off with a little bit about the popularity of not only the alternative music scene, but music in general right now. So when we think back to how we used to consume music in the past, and when we all first began to love this alternative music scene, this pop punk scene, one of the things that I think everybody is aware of is that we weren't really into streaming platforms. We didn't have the Spotifys, we didn't have the Apple Music. The way that we learned about new bands and artists and kind of determined who was at the top of the league was we heard them on the radio, we saw them at the top of the iTunes charts, or we saw them on the Warped Tour lineup. Now, obviously we have varying stages here of popularity, right? We had radio that was playing artists from this scene. We had radio playing Fall Out Boy. We had radio playing Paramore, Sum 41, Simple Plan, Linkin Park. They all got consistent airplay on radio. And that was happening around like the early 2000s to mid 2000s. And then I would say around 2010, it just kind of stopped. And there was a bit of a transition away from radio playing a little bit of everything and going more towards the pop route. And yes, there were still rock stations out there, but that was also around the time that Sirius XM was becoming big. So they kind of found their home over there. Now, when you look at the popularity back in those days, I just talked about the radio influence that we had, and we all knew that Fall Out Boy was huge. We all knew that Paramore was huge. But one of the other things that we saw was Warped Tour. Now, everybody loves Warped Tour. Everybody has their own memories about it, but Warped Tour was a special space for popularity, to me at least. We had a lot of the Mayday parades and the All Time Lows and bands like that that were really giants and stalwarts in that scene around that time that were consistently on that tour lineup that everybody knew who they were. I don't think at that point in time, if you asked anybody that said they were into that genre of music, if you said, hey, have you heard the new Mayday Parade album? They would say, absolutely, they were on their radar. And when you look at nowadays, how do we find new artists? How do we find who's the most prevalent artist in the scene? It's a lot more difficult, I think, at times to determine who is the biggest artist in the scene, who is the biggest name out there, because we don't have Warped Tour anymore. Yeah, we have When We Were Young Fest, but that also includes a lot of the bands from that time, as opposed to some of the newer and up-and-coming bands. And people don't really use iTunes anymore. You know, we've moved to that streaming platform. We moved to Apple Music, Amazon, Spotify, whatever it may be. But one of the things that I've noticed, and it's one of the things that I think artists really pay a lot of attention to as well, is the number of monthly listeners on Spotify. I think that is the benchmark for determining the popularity of not only a band, but also music in general, because a lot of our music now is from streaming. Yes, there's still radio, and yes, radio is still important, and artists in other genres are thrilled when they get number one hits on the radio, but it's a lot harder for our scene to have music play on mainstream radio, and it certainly is a lot harder to find a number one song or even a number one album from our scene on Billboard or something to that nature. You know, honestly, I can't remember the last time I saw an album or a song top the Billboard charts. You know, it's a lot harder too when you have an artist of, let's say, Taylor Swift's magnitude that is so consistently releasing music, both new and re-recorded, that's always going to shoot to the top of the charts. You know, we've kind of gotten to a point here in music where there are certain big name artists that, you know, as soon as they release an album, it's going to be number one. As soon as they release a new song, it's going to be number one, or it's going to be very close to number one. I think we just saw that with Olivia Rodrigo and her new song Vampire, which I personally am a huge fan of, and depending on the sound of that new album, may actually get a review over here, because I do think she's got a little bit of alternative rock in her. But, you know, we have the Billie Eilishes of the world, we have the Taylor Swifts, we have the Beyoncés, the Drakes, the Adeles, where you know what you're getting, you know it's going to be a number one hit, you know it's going to be out there, and then everybody moves on. And that's something that we didn't have back in the prime of this scene. So Spotify monthly listeners is a really good way, at least I think, of determining kind of where a band's at. Are they at the top of the game? Are they kind of up next? Are they still kind of under the radar? You know, it's an interesting thing when you look at monthly listeners. So monthly listeners, by definition, is the amount of unique listeners that have listened to your song within the past 28 days. So what that means is, let's use Bad Omens, for example. If I listen to Bad Omens today, and this is the first time that I've ever listened to Bad Omens, that makes me one unique listener. If I continue to listen to Bad Omens throughout the month, I still keep my one listener status. It doesn't change. I just become that one listener. So a band like Bad Omens, which we all would consider to be probably at the top of the line, at last check, they were at 4.15 million monthly listeners, and that's a significant number. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at some of the artists that we've talked about on this podcast, some of the artists that we all would probably consider, you know, top level scene stalwarts, top level legends in the scene, you know, whatever you want to call it. And I wanted to look at their monthly listeners and see if it correlated to what I would consider to be popularity. And the benchmark I'm going to use is 1 million, because I think that's the number of monthly listeners that bands get to, and then they really decide that, like, okay, you know, this is a huge milestone for us. Now, obviously, when we have bands or artists that are just starting out, you know, the 1,000, the 10,000, the 100,000, those are going to be huge numbers that are going to be important to them. But I think in terms of popularity, you can look at some of these thousands and say, okay, you know, at this point, I would say they're still up and coming. But at this point, I would say that they're probably, you know, a top level talent. So let's take a look at some of these artists. So the first group that I'm going to talk about here is legends of the scene. Bands that have been around since that early 2000s, even beforehand, that have really just kind of stated their place in this scene's history, right? So look at a band like Paramore. They just released a new album, but they're still consistently hitting at 21.3 million listeners. You look at a band like Motionless in White, 3.5 million listeners. You look at Sleep Token, who's probably the hottest band in this genre right now, and they're sitting at 2.5 million. So that 1 million benchmark, once you get past that, looks like it's pretty much a superstar in the scene, right? So let's look at some of those that are closer to that 1 million mark as opposed to the 4, 5, 20 millions, because I think we all know that like Fall Out Boy, Foo Fighters, all those are going to be in the high levels. Same thing with All Time Low. They're all going to be over that 4, 5, 7 million. I know that like Foo Fighters and Linkin Park are in the 20 and 30 millions. And that's just because look at the popularity level they had back then and look at what we have now. There's a way to look at your difference too, right? Like Bad Omens and Sleep Token are at the top of the scene right now, and they have 4 and 2 million listeners monthly respectively, whereas bands that we were hearing all the time and that were everywhere when we were growing up in Fall Out Boy and Linkin Park are at 29 and 34 million. It's a pretty drastic difference. But looking at some of the other bands that I would say are hot in the scene right now, Magnolia Park, they're sitting at 1.06 million. To me, that makes them top of the line, heavyweight in the scene. Everybody should know who Magnolia Park is at this point. You look at a band like Loveless, very similar to Magnolia Park, they're at 1.9 million. Another heavyweight in the scene, another one that everybody's going to be able to tell you that they know who they are. But then we look at some other bands that I would say are top of the line and top of the game right now, and you look and you see that they're a little bit less than a million, and they're still kind of getting to that major part. First band that I looked at with that was Dayseeker. Dayseeker is one of those bands that I think is pretty much a scene staple at this point, but they're sitting at 981,000 listeners monthly. You look at a band like Hot Mulligan, who has been around for a while, they're sitting at 864,000 monthly listeners. You look at Real Friends, they're sitting at 516,000 listeners. Devil Wears Prada, 969,000 listeners. Like, it's hard to look at those numbers and say, I thought they were more, I thought they would have more. I thought they would be in that 1 million club. But I also want to do a comparison, and I'm going to try to keep track of this for you guys. It's going to be hard, but I'm going to try to keep track of it for y'all. But I want to know if the monthly listeners increases around the first few months that, let's say, a new album drops, and then decreases as that album grows in time that it's been released. And I think a band that I can do that with is Arrows in Action, because they're obviously riding a huge high right now. They just got off a tour with Magnolia Park. They just released their debut album. They have their own solo headlining tour that they're on right now, and they're sitting at 674,000 monthly listeners. Now, is all of that attributed to the tours and the new album? Who knows? Personally, I think that's a great sign that they are right on the verge of being a scene staple, as they should be. But when we talk about them again in December, has that number gone down? Has that number gone up? We aren't really going to be too sure about that yet, right? So I'm going to keep track of some bands for you guys. Another band that I'm interested in doing that with is Meet Me at the Altar, another band that has just kind of risen to the top for me in terms of what I would consider to be popular. They're sitting at 347,000 monthly listeners. I know they're getting ready to drop a deluxe album of Past, Present, Future. I know they're getting ready to go on tour with 5 Seconds of Summer. That's a huge level of exposure. So let's see what that number gets to in a couple of months. So, the popularity aspect is also kind of subjective too, right? Because I'm sitting here saying that I think Arrows and I think Meet Me at the Altar and I think Dayseeker are top of the line. But there could be people out there that look at me and say, well, yeah, but what about the other bands that you've said you really have a lot of faith in, or other artists, right? Look at ones that you would say are under the radar. And under the radar is hard because, what's the benchmark? Because you have people like Sleep Theory, for example. They've dropped 2 singles. They don't have an album out yet, but yet they're sitting at 102,000 listeners monthly. And then you have a band like Friend Circle, who has put out multiple albums and who I think is fantastic, that has 14,000 monthly listeners. So it's kind of hard to say that both of them are under the radar because there's such a significant gap in monthly listeners. But I would say that both are considered under the radar because we have 2 singles from Sleep Theory, and Friend Circle has a lot less people listening to them monthly. So I think it's kind of a very subjective thing. And monthly listeners, while it can be great to be predictive of who's doing what, I think there's another example of how, we don't have the same ways to predict who's popular and who's not popular in our scene. And honestly, I'm going to be honest with this too. I don't think it really matters because I think our scene is going to support good music and great artists regardless of whether the mainstream sees them as acceptable, whether the mainstream sees them as the next big thing. Because guess what? That's not what this scene's about. This scene's about producing music that evokes this emotion and that gives people a safe space to go to concerts, go to shows, festivals, and really just feel like they're not being judged. And that's why I absolutely love this scene, because that is exactly what I felt at every show that I've gone to. I've never felt like anybody's judged. I've never felt like it's been somewhere that's not safe. I haven't been able to get with you guys in a couple of weeks, but I went to Yellowcard's 20th anniversary show. I was actually at the opening night, and I was able to see Yellowcard and Mayday Parade and Story of the Year and This Wild Life. And what a fun show that was. What a great time that was, and it just goes to show like how close this group is and how close this scene is, because Mayday Parade comes out to do their set, and I look to my right, and This Wild Life standing with fans watching Mayday Parade perform. That's not something that you see at every show. Yeah, some people do that the first night, but I've seen plenty of artists that just watch everybody's set each time they're on tour with them. And that just goes to show the community aspect that I was talking about. And, like I said, popularity don't matter to a lot of these artists. Yeah, they're trying to make it big, and yeah, they're trying to just put out good music, and that's great. So, and that's why I love talking about this scene. But one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, and this is part 2 of this podcast, we're going to do a really good transition there for me, but one of the ways that I was introduced to this genre, besides radio and all this other stuff, was in video games. And I think a lot of other people were the same way as well. Yeah, we got Fall Out Boy on the radio, and yeah, we got Paramore on the radio, but some of these other bands, like Yellowcard, like MXPX, like Sum 41, those artists weren't getting as heavy rotation as some of the other ones, so it was a little bit harder for us to find these bands. But video games at that time, especially sporting video games, were notorious for introducing these types of artists. So I want to just talk to you for a second about the 2003 to 2009 video games and just give you some names and songs from artists that we would consider part of the scene, or at least that I would consider part of the scene. And just think about it for a second about how crazy it is that all of these songs were featured in video games, and then we'll talk about, kind of where the breaking point was. So we're going to start with Madden, because Madden is probably the most well-known sports game out there. And in Madden 2003, we had songs, The Anthem from Good Charlotte, and Fine Again from Seether, and other artists were in that as well. I'm just pulling out some of the highlights from these games. 2004, we had Blink-182, Feeling This. We had All That's Left from Thrice. We had Way Away from Yellowcard. 2005, we had American Idiot from Green Day. We had This Disaster from Newfound Glory. Give It Up from Midtown in 2005. Moving into 2006, we have Backcountry from Avenged Sevenfold. 4 Words from Bullet for My Valentine. Dance Dance from Fall Out Boy. Like, look at all of these different names that are coming up. Go into 2007, we have Say Anything from Cartel. 2008, we get Underclass Hero from Sum 41. We get Fighting from Yellowcard. And then in 2009, we get a little bit of a shift, and we get Linkin Park, their collaboration with Busta Rhymes, which was We Made It, which was one of my favorite songs at the time. So think about that string right there, and just think about the names that I brought up. Think about the songs that I brought up. Move over to NHL. NHL was very big for that. NHL, you had Jimmy Eat World, you had Bowling for Soup, you had Fall Out Boy, you had Paramore, you had Coheed and Cambria, you had Panic at the Disco, all showing up on soundtracks from 2003 to 2009. And then one of my personal favorite games was the MVP baseball games, and that's really what I spent a lot of time on. And they had songs on there from All American Rejects, Sum 41. They had Seven, Wiser's Take Me As I Am in 2004, Trust Company, who I absolutely love, and I really wish we could get a reunion from them. You know, those are the types of tracks that I was listening to as I'm playing these games, and as video games started to gain popularity, we all started to hear as well. Even back in, kindergarten and first grade, my love for this genre started to develop. Everybody knows the soundtracks for Tony Hawk. I'm not getting into those. But, even games like I had Supercross 2000 on Nintendo 64, and the intro song was Next Big Thing from MXPX. That's just wild. And that has become one of my favorite songs of all time because, think about it, you're 6 years old, you hear this like rockin' song that you're riding around with motorcycles on and doing jumps and going over the whoop-de-doos and all these different things. And then around 2010, as we continue to get older and as we continue to play video games, because video games have become such a big part of society, we have a transition happen in these sports games. And the transition is from kind of including all of these different artists, all of these different sounds, and they're still including rock, but they're moving more towards classics, They're moving more towards Ozzy Osbourne, moving more towards Bon Jovi. And even when they are including some heavier stuff, it's on the metal side. So, it's hard to introduce people to new bands, or even for the bands to continue to put out those songs because they're not being included on these soundtracks anymore, right? And so we go probably 10 years without having a scene staple on a soundtrack that I can tell. And I'm sure that there are some on there that I missed, but the next instance that I really remember personally is when I was playing NHL 2020 and I heard Brand New Numb from Motionless in White. And that was kind of like a breath of fresh air, right? Like we get a song from Motionless in White that has started to become this, huge giant in what we still consider our scene and is starting to see a little bit of a turn. And then in 2022, we get another explosion. We get MGK, we get Jaden, we get Mod Sun, we get Kenny Hoopla. Now, I know some of you are going to say to me that those aren't really scene staples, but I think it's important to remember that we were stuck with a lot of pop music. We were stuck with a lot of pop rock music. And so to get somebody like MGK or Jaden or Mod Sun on there, it helps to bring that sound back in. Yes, it may not be the pop punk sound that we heard in 2004, but it kind of is at least a step in the right direction. And then this year in NHL 23, talk about an explosion. Day to Remember, Coheed and Cambria, Ghost, Gojira, Ian Dior, Mod Sun, Motionless in White, Real Friends, Sweco, Turnstile, Wind Waker. That's insanity to me. That is absolutely insane that we get this explosion. And yes, it's only in NHL because NFL has kind of transitioned into trying to develop hip-hop artists and give them a chance to kind of showcase. But it really does show that there has been a transition because EA Sports realized that this genre is making a comeback. We need to start including these people more. And so it's awesome to see video games starting to use some of the music that we all know is great and we all are excited about in their video games again. And, maybe it has to do with, trying to keep things popular or whatever, but wouldn't it be nice if we got a video game that kind of gave us that nostalgic feel? What if, like they say, let's look at Tony Hawk, for example, right? Yeah, they just did a remaster and they included some new songs in there, and they remastered, I think it was 1 and 2 on the PlayStation 4. Well, what if they redid 3 and 4? What if they did Underground? What if they had a new game like that? What if we had a new skateboard game? What if we had a new motocross game or something like that? What type of music would you want to hear on that? What sound would you want to hear? What artists would you want to see featured on that? So I've been thinking about that for a little bit. I've always loved video games. I've always loved alternative rock music. And so when you think about the sounds that you heard on those old soundtracks, it was very easy. At least I was one of these kids where I'd go into the menu, I'd remove all the songs I didn't want to hear, and I'd be playing Yellow Card, I'd be playing Blink-182, whatever was on there at the time. All the rock songs would be the ones that I was listening to, and the other ones were just turned off. Think about, let's say we have a new Tony Hawk game, right? Let's say that we're creating a soundtrack for that. What would you guys want to hear? And you can leave that in the comments section of this episode. But I came up with 20 tracks that I think really would fit that sound. And, we can even say that it kind of crosses over into EA Sports, whether that's baseball, football, soccer, hockey, whatever it may be, right? So let's take a look at those 20 tracks, and I'll talk a little bit about each one and why I think it would be good on there. So this was no easy task, right? Because there's so much good music out there, and there's so many things that are possible, and so many ways that you can look at it. But I think when you're starting a soundtrack for a sports game, whether it's, extreme sports, I would love to see like an X Games video game where you're able to pick kind of what extreme sport you want to do. So we're going to go off the basis that that's what you can do. Let's say we have BMX, motocross, skate, and whatever else on there, right? So the first one that I'm going to put on there is I got to get a scene stalwart on here, and I got to make it Bad Omens. And I think Like a Villain makes the most sense. It's got commercial appeal. Most people know that song, whether it's from TikTok, whether they've seen him live, whatever it may be. Like a Villain's a great track to kind of kick it off. Then I think the new one from Sweco, Help Me, would be another great one. It's got a little bit more of a gritty sound to it, and it really kind of feeds into that style that we're looking for an X Games type sound. And then you got to include a song that features 3 of the biggest bands in the scene right now, the Credits from Arrows in Action, Magnolia Park, and Loveless. That is a little bit different sound-wise. It's not as heavy. It's a little bit more on the light side, but it's one of those tracks that really kind of can compete with a song like Feeling This, I feel like, that we heard back in 2004. So I think it's one of those that you always kind of have to have a little bit of a slower sound to go along with some of our heavier stuff. The next one is Get Away from Basement Gary. It's a song that I talked about briefly on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and it is one of those that really just I envision skating around in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1, going up and down the half pipe with that playing in the background. That just seems like the perfect setting for that track, so we got to include that one on here. The next one is Sunny Smile from Mouth Culture, another kind of borderline heavy track that really just would set a great tone and continue that momentum that we're getting from those ones that I talked about before. Same thing with our next one, Kinda Over It from Young Culture, a song that I have not talked about on the podcast before, but it's one that has just been kind of a staple for me since getting back into the scene heavier and, discovering newer bands or bands that may not be at the top of everybody's list. And speaking of bands that more people need to know about, I also would going to include Lost As I Am from Imbalance. You guys know that I love that track. You know that I love that band. Their new one just dropped a couple days ago. I'm excited to talk about that next time we all get together. But Lost As I Am really does have that extreme sports feel to it. It's got those, quick leads into the chorus. It's got the great vocals behind it. It's not super heavy. And I think that's something that's important to stop here and talk about is that, we want stalwarts in there. And even when we have Motionless on a soundtrack, it's not one of their heavier songs. We don't get the Chris Motionless blech. We don't get a lot of those, right? It's hard to include that because that's just not an easy way to do things, but it's been done before. I mean, MVP04 went for it with Trust Company and Surfacing. Surfacing is heavy. It's really heavy. So I can remember numerous times having my parents come in the room and say, who in the hell is screaming on your TV? And I'm like, oh, don't worry. That's just the soundtrack. So you kind of have to pick and choose here. So we're going to keep it kind of light, but we also are going to just mix in a little bit of that heaviness. The next track that I'm going to throw on there is Say It to My Face from Meet Me at the Altar. Another one that's got a lot of commercial appeal. I really didn't mean that as a pun because it's been used in as a commercial, but either way, Meet Me at the Altar has a lot of appeal in there as well with that track. High energy, great for a background track as you're skating around or as you're driving around on your BMX bike. Also going to put Black Pixie from Misfortune on here. Another one that has a little bit heavier of a sound to it, but another track that I think would fit perfectly into our extreme sports kind of feel. Bring Me the Horizon, another scene stalwart. We got to put Lost on there right now. I think that's probably one that makes a lot of sense to put on there. We obviously have to have our stalwarts on there while still introducing people to some of the newer bands. That's where we get our Bad Omens, our Bring Me the Horizon, and our next one, which would be Love from the Other Side from Fall Out Boy. I think Fall Out Boy still is creating great tracks that can go on these different soundtracks, and I'm kind of surprised they weren't on the NHL soundtrack. I feel like they are just the poster boys for NHL right now with doing a bunch of different all-star game activities and things like that. But another stalwart that kind of helps bring people in. And then we got another introduction here, right? We have South Arcade with Unaware, another really softer track in terms of the vocals, but it has that high energy music behind it that can really help bring more people in. Same thing from Holding Absence with their song Crooked Melody. I think that's a really strong track. Gives me a little bit of it kind of gives me that Seven Wiser feel in terms of what it does for the soundtrack. It's still a little bit slower, and it keeps everybody just kind of slowed down a little bit if you want to get away from some of the upbeats that we've done. Speaking of stalwarts, Linkin Park and their new one Lost has to be on there, because what better way to include artists on there than to get that nostalgic locked away secret tape that we got from Linkin Park with Lost. There's a couple other ones, Fighting Myself, that really could be in conversation here, but I think Lost makes a lot of sense, and that's another one that it gives us that heaviness. It gives us a band that's been featured on soundtracks before that people are going to flock to. I talk about skate punk a lot, and it would not be a soundtrack, especially for a extreme sports game, if I didn't include Bridge the Gap. We're going to put My Creation on there, another one that's really slower music-wise, but it's still got that heavy sound to it that we all have come to know and love, and that we expect to hear in some of these games as well. So got to put My Creation on there. Also going to introduce everybody, or continue to introduce everybody, to Archetypes Collide and Parasite. Another really heavy track that really can continue that momentum that we talked about before and really just give people a different sound. A lot of people complain that pop punk or alt rock or whatever you want to call it sounds a lot of the same. Archetypes Collide helps kind of break that stereotype that, even though it's not really true, it gives people another way to be like, okay, yeah, no, this isn't the same thing that we're used to hearing. Same thing here with Friend Circle and their song Orange Tang, another one that I think would fit perfectly on a soundtrack for an extreme sports game. And then going to introduce everybody to Happy Days and their song Faded. That's more along the poppy side, I would say. So it doesn't, necessarily fit our extreme sports sound, but I think that track is perfect for a soundtrack. So looking forward to putting that one on here. And, we're down to 2 spots. And those are always the hardest. And I'll talk about some of the other songs that I considered, or at least other artists that I considered for this. But the next track that we're going to include is Airhead from Honey Revenge. High energy, high tempo, one that I think would make a lot of people happy to hear it on a soundtrack, and it would really go over well. And then the last one we're going to do is Holiday from Turnstile. I think Turnstile is one of those bands that checks all the boxes in terms of heaviness and appeal and things like that. And let's be honest, who wouldn't mind going around, let's say we're doing X Games and we're doing motocross best trick, and who wouldn't mind doing a double backflip while the holiday breakdown goes through, right? I think that would be awesome. So those are your 20 tracks. I'm actually going to build a playlist for you guys and link it in the description that you can listen to all 20 of these songs and think about whether or not you would like to hear that in the background while you're playing your next favorite video game. But let's talk about some other bands that can be included or should be included. I just did 20, but obviously, you can put as many as you want on a soundtrack. I think Dayseeker has a lot of options there. It's just a matter of which one you want to do. Same thing, Spirit Box and their song The Void. I think that would make a lot of sense on a soundtrack as well. And then you get into some of the bands that are probably lesser known. And I think Not My Weekend and their song Shut Up would make a lot of sense. One of the songs off of the new Pyrophonics album From Heavenward would make a lot of sense. I think any of the 2.0s that we've gotten from Busted this year would make a lot of sense, whether you want to really go for it and throw Mbop on there or whether you just want it to be one of the other ones. I think 408 would make a lot of sense on here. Story of the Year would make a lot of sense on here. And, a song like Self-Destruct from 0936, I think that's a huge potential on there. And really anybody could have a song that could fit on here. There's not really any restrictions. And that's what's so nice about doing something fun like this is, I get to be a little bit more creative. I get to think a little bit and, think about if this was ever going to come to the forefront. I think right now would be a great time for it. We're kind of getting just overloaded with great music and great music from this scene. So why not create a X Games style game where you can get all of these artists on there? That wraps it up for us here this week. Like I said, this was just kind of like a little fun exercise, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to think about the video game aspect and talk about just, how things have changed over the years. And I think everybody can agree that we all discover music in different ways. And, later on in the future, I'll talk about my music discovery process as we continue to grow in popularity and as we continue to introduce people to new bands. And I get all the time, how did you find this person? How did you find this band? How did you find this artist? How do you know who they are? We'll get into that at a later date. I'll tell you guys all about what I do and how I find things. And, that's the fun of it is, finding new people all the time. But in the meantime, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Matrix Music Review. Head on over there and follow us. If you want to keep up with me daily, Instagram's the best place to do it. I post on there all the time. And I'm always posting tour announcements on there. I'm always posting, different songs, things like that. On Spotify, go ahead and like our Control-Alt-Save playlist. That's where you can find all of the music that I'm listening to right now, everything we talk about on the podcast, and whatever else may pop up at the time. As I said, I'm going to make a playlist of these 20 tracks so that you guys can listen to it. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet. Probably the video game playlist. I don't know. But you'll get it linked in the description of this episode. And then do me a favor, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you follow us, 5-star review, leave us a comment. Leave me a comment. Let me know what tracks you think should be included on a video game, what tracks from video games really got you into this genre, what got you into this scene, or, just a memory that you had from it. I love hearing that people found bands from, Madden 2004 or something like that. That's always cool to hear. So do that. And while you're at it, share this podcast with your friends, your family, whoever you want. Continue to grow our little community here and let us, keep introducing people to some more of these great artists that are out. And so people don't have to listen to the same 5 songs on repeat, right? So that's it for this week. As always, for my Spotify listeners, I know we have somebody play us out. So I am going to do that this week, and I am going to do that this week with the song that really got me into the alternative scene, one of my favorites from a video game, and I am going to give it to Next Big Thing from MXPX. See you guys.